They called him mad, dirty, shameless, but he only laughed. Because to Diogenes, it was the world that had lost its mind. Imagine a man who lived in a barrel, barked at powerful men, and once wandered the streets with a lantern in broad daylight claiming he was looking for an honest man. He rejected wealth, status, comfort, everything civilization claimed to be sacred, and he did it with a grin. But behind that grin was something deeper, a challenge, a mirror, a truth most people would rather not face. Diogenes didn't just question society, he mocked it. Not to be cruel, but because he believed that only through laughter, sharp, biting laughter, could the world wake up from its delusions. In an age obsessed with image and honor, he stripped everything down to the raw, unfiltered core of what it meant to be human. And what he found was both terrifying and liberating. Born in Sinope around 412 BCE, Diogenes came from a respectable family. His father was a banker, but a scandal involving defaced currency forced them into disgrace and exile. Many philosophers find their calling through books, debate, or teaching. Diogenes found his through humiliation. Cast out of polite society, he began to see its rules for what they really were, illusions, and he decided to live without them. He traveled to Athens, the intellectual heart of the world. But instead of becoming another voice in the echo chamber of philosophers, he did something radical. He chose poverty, not out of necessity, but out of principle. He believed that virtue wasn't taught in schools or found in wealth. It came from nature, from stripping away everything artificial. If civilization had corrupted the soul, then to save the soul, one had to reject civilization. His philosophy became known as cynicism, from the Greek word kainikos, meaning dog-like. And that's exactly how he lived, like a stray dog among men. He ate scraps. He slept wherever he could. He relieved himself in public. He did not care what anyone thought. Because to Diogenes, shame was a product of false values. He wasn't trying to be shocking. He was trying to be free. The barrel he slept in wasn't a stunt. It was a statement, a rejection of all that was unnecessary. While others debated virtue in marble halls, Diogenes lived it in the streets. When asked how he managed with so little, he pointed to a child drinking from his hands and threw away his own cup. When offered a lavish home, he laughed and said the sun shone just as well on the ground. He wasn't anti-civilization for the sake of rebellion. He just saw it for what it really was, a cage gilded with lies. Diogenes saw that most people weren't living, they were performing. Slaves to reputation, appearances, and artificial needs. And so he made it his mission to expose their contradictions. Not with long-winded arguments, but with acts that cut through pretense, like a blade. When he saw a rich man surrounded by servants, he begged him to give up his wealth to be truly free. When he saw a temple priest collecting donations, he asked why the gods needed money. He mocked, ridiculed, and laughed, not because he hated people, but because he wanted them to wake up. He became famous, even as he mocked fame. He had no possessions, yet he was richer than kings in spirit. His words burned because they were rooted in honesty. He didn't flatter. He didn't appease. He simply said what others were too afraid to. And in that fearless truth-telling, people found both offense and awe. Even Plato, who rarely admired those outside his philosophical circle, once called Diogenes a Socrates gone mad. But that madness had method. While Socrates asked questions to uncover truth, Diogenes used mockery to destroy lies. He believed that society was so upside down that the only sane response was to act insane. And by doing so, he forced people to confront their own absurdities. One of his most famous moments came when Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, came to visit him. Alexander stood before the filthy philosopher and offered to grant him any wish. Diogenes simply replied, "Step aside. You're blocking my sun." In that single moment, he reduced empire, conquest, and ego to dust. He didn't need anything Alexander could offer, and that terrified people. Because true freedom always does, Diogenes didn't write books. He didn't found schools. He left no doctrines. And yet, his shadow stretches across centuries. Because he understood something that civilization still struggles to accept, that the more we build around ourselves, the more we risk losing what's inside. That in chasing progress, we forget presence. That in seeking approval, we lose authenticity. He wasn't anti-human. He was anti-falsehood. He saw hypocrisy in religious leaders, vanity in philosophers, greed in the wealthy, and fear in the masses. And he laughed, not to mock their suffering, but to shatter their illusions. He believed that if you could see the absurdity of the world, you could begin to live freely in it. Diogenes didn't preach that everyone should live in a barrel or reject all possessions. His point was deeper. He was showing that happiness is not about having more, but needing less. That virtue isn't in what you wear, but how you live. That wisdom isn't found in books, but in courageously facing the truth of existence. He became a mirror. And like all honest mirrors, he was both hated and revered. Because when you look into a mirror like Diogenes, you don't see the world, you see yourself. Your fears, your masks, your attachments. And if you're brave enough, you also see the path to letting them go. But why does a man like this matter today? In a world drowning in noise, where identity is curated and self-worth measured in likes, Diogenes offers a radical alternative. Be real, be raw, be fearless. Strip away the layers until only truth remains. He didn't need civilization's approval because he had something greater, peace. And yet, he wasn't cold or bitter. He was playful. He laughed because he saw how ridiculous the world had become. His humor wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Like a jester who tells the truth no one else dares to. And that laughter still echoes. Because in mocking the world, Diogenes helped us remember what it means to truly live. He challenged people not by force, but by example. Not by arguing against the system, but by stepping outside of it. He didn't wait for change, he became the change. And in doing so, he turned his life into a living philosophy. A question carved into the skin of civilization. What do you really need to be free? The world builds walls. Diogenes tore them down. But not with violence, with questions, gestures, and the simplest acts. He didn't stage revolutions. He revealed illusions. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, he sat below all and smiled above it. People saw a beggar, but they didn't see his freedom. They saw filth, but not his detachment. They saw madness, but not his method. What scared them most was that he might be right. He once saw a young man drinking excessively at a banquet and laughed, saying, if only he could see himself as he truly is. It wasn't condemnation, it was revelation. Diogenes believed most of us wear disguises so convincing that we forget who we are underneath. His life was a campaign against self-deception. And in that war, every act was a weapon, even silence, even laughter, even simply lying on the ground while others bowed to kings. He wasn't attacking society out of hate. He was trying to save the soul from decay. Because in comfort, we grow soft. In obedience, we lose courage. And in imitation, we forget the original spark that makes us human. Diogenes never forgot. He wanted others to remember. He saw excess as a form of enslavement. Not just material wealth, but mental clutter, the ideas, opinions, and fears we inherit from others without question. He once said, "People laboriously seek happiness while it lies right next to them." He believed we complicate our lives in the name of progress, while truth remains simple, direct, raw. Just like nature, the modern world might view him as a lunatic. But perhaps that's because he held up a mirror and didn't flinch. Where we hide behind filters and distractions, he walked bare. His rejection of society wasn't rejection of humanity. It was the deepest respect for it, the belief that we are born with everything we need to live a good life. Civilization, in his view, only got in the way. He studied people the way some study texts. He would observe crowds in the marketplace and shake his head. "So many things I do not need," he would mutter. And in that single statement lies the core of his wisdom. While the world expands outward, more, faster, bigger, he went inward. His empire was his mind, his kingdom, self-mastery. Even his most scandalous acts were not for attention but demonstration. He believed that if nature wasn't ashamed, then why should man be? What we call vulgar, he called honest. What we call proper, he called performative. He lived without shame because he saw shame as a social invention, a leash around the human spirit. He once walked through the marketplace holding a plucked chicken and declared, "Behold, Plato's man," mocking Plato's definition of a human as a featherless biped. His humor was direct and dangerous. It deflated the intellectual arrogance of his time. He didn't reject knowledge, he rejected pretense. He had no patience for empty talk. When he saw a philosopher delivering a pompous lecture on virtue, he stood before the crowd and began eating loudly, mocking the hypocrisy of preaching simplicity while living in excess. He showed, again and again, that real wisdom isn't spoken, it's lived. But Diogenes wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He simply saw through the game, and he laughed. He saw emperors as boys in costumes, scholars as parrots repeating dead words, merchants as slaves to gold. He mocked them not to tear them down, but to awaken them. He wanted people to see that the things they chased, status, wealth, admiration, were phantoms, and that in chasing them they lost their soul. He taught without teaching. His classroom was the city. His students, anyone brave enough to be uncomfortable. He made people squirm because he made them see. In a world that rewards conformity, he was the embodiment of freedom. His very existence asked the question, what if everything you believe is a lie? His critics said he contributed nothing to society. But that was the point. He didn't want to contribute to a system he saw as broken. Instead, he became a living critique, a walking contradiction that exposed the contradictions of others. He once said, "I am looking for an honest man." But what he really sought was truth, naked, uncomfortable, unfiltered. His life forces us to ask, what lies do we live under? What masks do we wear? What comforts do we mistake for purpose? And what would it mean to let them go? The power of Diogenes was not in his defiance, but in his indifference. He could not be bribed, shamed, or silenced. What can you do to a man who owns nothing, fears nothing, and needs nothing? That kind of freedom is terrifying to those who live inside cages of their own making, and yet his legacy endured. Centuries after his death, Stoics would embrace his spirit. existentialists would nod in his direction. Rebels, monks, mystics, all would recognize a piece of him in their journey, because beneath his wild exterior was a man who had tamed the inner world. And once you've done that, nothing outside can enslave you. He once said, "The foundation of every state is the education of its youth." But he didn't mean institutional education. He meant soul education, the kind that teaches courage, integrity, and detachment. He saw a world of grown men still chasing toys, still craving approval, still terrified of truth. And so he became the wild dog who barked at their illusions. There's something timeless in his madness, because his madness reveals our own. When a man mocks emperors and sleeps in a barrel yet remains unshaken, we must ask, who's truly insane? Him or us? The laughter of Diogenes is not a joke. It is a mirror. It asks, what are you really afraid of? Poverty, shame, rejection? Or is it that if you let go of everything you've built your identity on, your job, your image, your possessions, you might realize how little you actually need? He invites us to imagine another way of being, one rooted not in acquisition, but authenticity, not in masks, but in meaning. He knew that simplicity is not a lack, it's a liberation, and that in embracing what the world calls nothing, we find everything. His body was buried long ago, but his spirit lives in every act of rebellion against pretense, in every moment of raw honesty, in every person who dares to laugh at what others take too seriously. Civilization will always fear men like Diogenes, because they remind us that the emperor may, in fact, have no clothes. He never sought followers. And yet, his philosophy endures. Because at some point, we all get tired of pretending, tired of the race, tired of the noise, and we yearn for something real. That's when the voice of Diogenes returns, not as a whisper, but as laughter echoing through the hollow halls of falsehood. There's a strange kind of power in being laughed at if you're the one who understands the joke. Diogenes understood. He wielded ridicule like a scalpel, cutting through the bloated flesh of society's illusions. When people called him mad, he smiled. When they mocked him, he nodded. Their insults were badges of honor, signs that he had touched a nerve, exposed a lie, broken a spell. He once walked through Athens in daylight with a lantern, saying, "I am looking for an honest man." But he never found one, not because people didn't speak truth, but because they didn't live it. Diogenes wasn't interested in words. He wanted the kind of honesty that radiates from the core of a being, the honesty that cannot be faked, and that made him dangerous. Kings ruled armies. Philosophers ruled ideas. But Diogenes ruled neither, and yet disturbed both. Alexander the Great, the most powerful man of his age, came to meet him. The young emperor stood before the filthy old man and said, "Ask of me anything." Diogenes, barely glancing up, replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Power meets peace. Empire meets freedom. And it is the emperor who feels small. What kind of man is unmoved by empires? Diogenes understood something the world still struggles to grasp, that real power is not control over others, but mastery over self. The ability to say no, to walk away, to need nothing, to laugh, not because the world is amusing, but because you've stopped taking it seriously. He believed that civilization itself had become a performance. People playing roles, wearing masks, chasing scripts written by others. He saw men spending their lives acquiring things they didn't need, to impress people they didn't like, in order to escape the fear they refused to name. The fear of being alone with themselves. But Diogenes was alone with himself every day, and he was free. He lived in a wine barrel, owned nothing, begged for food, mocked the gods, rejected custom, exposed hypocrisy, and yet people listened. Not because he had riches or status, but because he had something far rarer: alignment. His thoughts, words, and actions were one. That kind of integrity is magnetic, even when it's abrasive. He once defaced a statue by asking for alms from it, explaining that he was getting used to rejection. That wasn't cynicism. That was training the mind to be immune to embarrassment, to ego, to external approval. He was forging an indestructible inner life by detaching from the outer world, and that made him powerful in a way society couldn't touch. He didn't fight the world. He simply ignored its rules. When people asked him where he was from, he said, "I am a citizen of the world." A bold claim in an age when identity was tightly bound to city-states and loyalty. But Diogenes had no use for borders. His philosophy transcended them. He didn't want to belong to a nation. He wanted to belong to nature, to truth, to something that couldn't be corrupted by politics or greed. He mocked wealth by living in poverty. He mocked manners by living in truth. He mocked power by demonstrating that power over others means nothing if you don't have power over yourself. And he did all of this not with anger, but with laughter. That's why he is remembered, not as a tyrant or a preacher, but as a trickster sage. A man who revealed the absurdity of the world by refusing to play along. He was both mirror and flame. People looked at him and saw their own fears, their own attachments, their own invisible chains. And some hated him for it. But others woke up because, in mocking the world, he awakened the soul. He once said, "It is the privilege of the gods to want nothing, and of godlike men to want little." That sentence holds the seed of his entire worldview. Diogenes wasn't against having, he was against being had. Against being owned by your desires. Against mistaking comfort for happiness, conformity for virtue, fear for wisdom. He knew that most people are not free. They are just well-behaved. They are trapped in golden cages, worshipping comfort and calling it peace, chasing success and calling it meaning, obeying rules and calling it morality. Diogenes shattered those illusions, not by giving speeches, but by living in radical authenticity. He stripped away everything society said was necessary. And what remained was something rare, something radiant. A man who could not be broken because he had nothing left to lose. His very life was a question. What happens when you remove all the masks? The answer wasn't pretty. It was uncomfortable, but it was true. And that is why he laughed. He didn't laugh at others because he felt superior. He laughed because he saw the absurdity we refuse to name, that the emperor fears opinions, that the philosopher clings to pride, that the citizen is terrified of silence, and that we build our entire lives around avoiding ourselves. But he didn't avoid himself. He sat with his own emptiness and discovered fullness. In the absence of possessions, he found peace. In the absence of titles, he found identity. In the absence of rules, he found clarity. It was not a rejection of life. It was a deeper embrace of it, a return to essence. And that's why, even today, his name survives. Not because he conquered or built or ruled, but because he pointed at the world and said, "Look." And when we looked, we saw not him, but ourselves exposed, confused, pretending. And in that mirror, something shifted. We began to wonder, what if freedom isn't out there? What if it's inside? What if the only chains are the ones we refuse to see? Diogenes offered no doctrine, no map, no formula, only a question, a smirk, a lantern in daylight. He didn't try to lead. He tried to disturb. Because in disturbance, truth stirs. In a time when people bowed to idols, he bowed to nothing. In a world of noise, he became silence. In a culture of performance, he became presence. And it cost him everything, but gave him something priceless. To understand, Diogenes is not just to study a philosopher. It is to confront a mirror that doesn't flatter. He lived with less than a slave, and yet felt freer than kings. He had no roof, no wealth, no social standing, but he possessed something most people lose without even noticing: sovereignty of the soul. He didn't call himself a rebel. He didn't need a cause. His existence itself was a form of protest. He showed that you don't have to rage against the system if you simply stop participating in its illusions. That truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be lived. And that sometimes the wisest man is the one you laugh at because he's too free to care. He taught without a classroom. He broke down belief without violence. His life was his lecture, his actions his argument. When people asked what philosophy meant to him, he didn't answer, he demonstrated. Barefoot in winter, naked in summer, fearless in truth. His life said, if I can be happy with nothing, then what does that say about your everything? We like to imagine that ancient philosophers sat quietly beneath olive trees, writing lofty ideas with calm dignity. Diogenes shattered that image. He was raw, unfiltered, wild. Not because he lacked wisdom, but because he had burned away everything that wasn't. He stripped philosophy down to its bones, not theory, but transformation. Not talk, but truth. Not abstraction, but action. In him, we see what it means to return to source, to peel away layers of social conditioning until only the essence remains. The animal, the soul, the spark. He wasn't trying to become something. He was unbecoming everything that wasn't him. And what remained was clarity. That's why he barked like a dog. Why he lived in a barrel. Why he rejected gold, pride, ceremony, and convention. He was reclaiming the power of simplicity, the sacredness of the present, the immovable peace that arises when nothing can be taken from you. He asked one question again and again, in different ways, with different actions. Who are you without your name, without your money, without your reputation, without your followers, titles, degrees, or legacy? Who are you when no one is looking? Diogenes didn't need an answer. He was the answer. He once said, I threw away my cup when I saw a child drinking from his hands. That sentence alone contains a revolution. It is not a call to minimalism. It is a call to wakefulness. To observe how easily we become dependent on things and how quickly those things begin to own us. How simplicity is not poverty, but power. There's a fire in that kind of philosophy. A dangerous kind. One that burns illusions instead of lighting candles. It doesn't ask you to agree. It dares you to live. He didn't want followers. He wanted witnesses, not people to admire him, but people to remember who they are, because we are all born wild and free. Before the layers, before the masks, before society tells us who to be and what to fear. Diogenes invites us to remove those layers, not to regress, but to rediscover, to return, to remember that a free mind laughs, that a peaceful soul is immune to status, that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. And so, his laughter echoes through time. It's not the laughter of mockery. It's the laughter of release, the kind of laughter that rises when the weight falls off, when the performance ends, when you realize that all the roles were fiction and you were never the mask. He is not a relic. He is a reminder. That civilization, no matter how advanced, is only as free as the minds that build it. That wisdom is not in accumulation, but in liberation. And that the truest philosopher may not be the one who speaks best, but the one who needs to say nothing at all. So maybe the question isn't, why did Diogenes mock civilization? Maybe the question is, what part of civilization still fears his laughter? Now I want to hear from you. What do you think Diogenes would mock today? Share your thoughts below, and let's bring his lantern into our modern world. Your comment might just light the path for someone still wandering in the dark.